Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about a struggle that I've been working with over some years actually, but particularly in the last few weeks about times and dates. Move forward. Is it? Yes, okay, right, it's actually working. Another title for this talk would be 𝗟 recherche des dates perdues, which is because I've been struggling. So the outline of my talk today, I want to talk briefly about diachronic study for language research. I want to talk about how dates are represented. I want to talk about timelines. This seems to me to be quite a timely issue because of the very unfortunate timelines and data graphs that we've been getting over the last 2.5 months, or presumably in China, if something like 4 or 5 months, showing graphs of all sorts of problems to do with the virus. And I'm going to think about the issue of filtering and sorting and exporting pictures for these timelines that we might be interested in working with. So that's really my focus. It's quite different from Randy's presentation, which gave us a very purposeful and focused set of ideas about how to teach and learn languages. Here I'm just concentrating on corpus linguistics, and it's really basically to do with producing graphs which can illustrate something changing through time when you're looking at words using corpus linguistic methods. Diachronic corpus studies have been around for quite a long time. There's been a lot of synchronic focus on lexis and language structure. So perhaps most of the original corpus work done from the 1960s forwards was intended to be largely synchronic, looking at the structure of language and vocabulary and grammar that were in use at the time, and not through a time perspective. But there have also been quite a lot of serious historical corpora created and serious corpus work done, and these are some of the examples of work that's being done all over the world. And I am not very well qualified to talk about historical corpus linguistics. It's not something I've worked in myself to any great extent. I'm talking today about a struggle that I've been engaged in trying to make sense of certain things. So there's some serious historical corpora that have been around. And then, of course, there are also some means of comparison that have been made where you're able to take a corpus and then take the same corpus or a very similar corpus 3 or 4 decades later and study the changes that have taken place in the corpus, in the two corpora, lob and flob, brown and frown, and various different generations of the British national corpus. So quite a lot of that has been going on, and I'm very respectful of this work, but I've not actually taken an active part in it myself. So it's not as if diachronic work has not been done. This is timely then, this issue. I think it's timely. And here's an example from Mark Davies's very recent coronavirus corpus, which he's made available to us all online. There'll be a reference. This paper has already been shared to the system. I don't know how you access it, but I've copied it to where Tony pointed me to. So it should be available to people. And at the end of the presentation, there are some links so that if you want to get a hold of the coronavirus corpus or do work with it, it's pretty similar to what Randy was showing us, other stuff from Mark Davies's site. But here's one from social distance that was created quite recently. And if you look at it, you can see that there was a peak in this expression. This is worldwide, in the expression social distance and social distancing. And the biggest one is round about the 21st of March. After that, perhaps it diminishes slightly. So there's one way of looking, using existing corpora at how things change through time. And this is a very simple sort of horizontal histogram, which represents the data, I think, pretty dramatically, makes its point very, very clearly. And of course, it's nice that you've got all sorts of interesting ways of clicking and seeing more. Now, here's a puzzle to you all. What is it that peaks in early March? If you look at the 1st of March, the 11th of March, and then the 21st of March, you've got big bars there. And it's pretty obvious that something happened. What is it that peaks then? This is, again, just a different view with a different search term. I don't know if you're able to predict this. This, I think, is worldwide. It certainly was the case in our country, in the United Kingdom. We noticed it. There you go. That's what it was that people were all talking about and actually hoarding and panic buying. So this corpus procedure enables one to get hold of something and see how it goes up and down in time. And this is what I've been interested in doing for quite a long time, and that's really the topic of my talk today. What about dates then? What do we want to have happen with dates? I've got dates in the computer, in the hard disk, and well, one problem is that computers can basically only store dates since 1970 or 1980 on their hard disk. Different computer systems might have 1970 or might have 1980. Some clever ways have been found. Excel can store dates, I believe, from 1900 onwards. But what if you got an Excel document and you want to represent 1853? SPSS, I remember learning the SPSS package back in the 1970s, and we used to use cards. We used to have to go to the cafeteria. So I was working in Mexico. You used to have to go to the cafeteria and buy 100 cards from the cafe there and type in the program that you did with the statistical package for the social sciences. That's really going back almost to 1582. But in those days, that was the way we did it. And every time you made a typing mistake, of course, you ruined the card and the program didn't run at all. Apparently, SPSS can save dates from 1582. Now, why 1582? I have no idea. So dates are quite problematic because human beings really want to refer to dates, all sorts of dates, and literary text or historically important text, newspaper text, and so on, go well back before 1970 or 1870. And so how are we going to deal with this issue? It seems to me that one ideal would be that the date of publication of a text should be known and should be easily accessed. That, I think, is not the case at the moment. A lot of the texts I have on my computer, and I've got quite a lot of texts from various countries in various languages, some of which I don't understand because I've been writing computer programs for a long, long time, and some of the time I have to look at Japanese and Arabic and Chinese, which I don't actually read, in order to try to make the programs actually perform. The date of program publication is often not known. You've got a piece of text and you've no idea when it came from, or the date on the operating system on your hard disk, the date that the computer thinks about, is a recent date, and the actual piece of text is from a couple of hundred years ago. So we don't match up with the ideal at all. Another issue that's important too is that date references within a publication. A publication may talk about lots of different dates, and we can find them fairly easily if they begin with a number 1. If it's sort of 1593, it's 4 digits and it begins with a 1. But that's pretty crude. And so perhaps finding date references is a bit like finding all sorts of other sociological or gender references. Who wrote this? What age were they? Where did they come from? What sex were they? And so on and so forth. So it's perhaps a matter of markup. In this ideal world, we would then know for each publication what date it is. We'd be able to know which dates it refers to that may not be the same date as the date it was published. And we would have some simple way of storing dates in the operating system so that the computer itself could sort things by the appropriate date. And then it would be very easy in an ideal world to retrieve dates by some sort of markup. And we could look at them and say, this text talks about this date and that date and the other date. And we could then represent the kind of world they're talking about in that way. As a software designer, my struggle consists of writing all sorts of gibberish like this, lines of code, struggling with the task of representing dates and plotting them on a screen, and that's really what I'm trying to talk about today. I've had to generate a certain number of workarounds because the ideal isn't actually present at all. We've got the real world that we live in. So we have to find a way round, and one of them is to save a date in some other format in some way along with the file name. The file name is very convenient. Funnily enough, the British National Corpus, when it was first issued, used the most amazingly unintuitive and uninformative file names that were all sort of B53 and J11. There was no rhyme or reason to it. I've never found out what the logic was of it, but the idea that you would put some information on a computer and give it an almost random file name which can convey any meaning at all seems to have been missing a pretty obvious trick. And of course nowadays, now in 2020, I think most of us do tend to have better file names perhaps than were done in those early days. I was certainly guilty way back in the 1980s when I started using computers and writing computer programs of, for example, writing something and saving it on my hard disk as letter when I'd written a letter to somebody. And then, of course, the next year I can't possibly find that letter. I have no idea what it's about and I have to open it again to look at it. So one of my workarounds is to find a way of saving a date in some other format along with the file name and the file path, the various different parts of the file structure, which can be very useful ways of organizing one's data and knowing where one's got everything. And to devise a system, which in my case, I've decided, this is some years back, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, could perhaps work from something like 4000 BC onwards. I didn't think there was much point in going further back in time before 4000 BC, but and I've never had to work with any texts of 4000 BC, to be quite frank. But that was the system I thought maybe we ought to allow for something which goes back a long way. This requires a system for the user to specify dates of texts. And I'll show you a couple examples of how that can be done. One method is with a sort of plain text list of some sort with the actual dates, and then the user has to actually take the trouble of creating the list of here Shakespeare plays and typing in the dates and finding out what the dates are for each play. And then once you've got a list saved, and I've called that one Shakespeare plays dated plain.txt, then it can be input easily enough into a computer program, in this case Wordsmith. And then it will then mean that every time you want to refer to the Shakespeare plays, the system will know that the Comedy of Errors was written in 1592, and so on. Here's another example of plain text with a list. I did this one much more recently. I was working with the Dickens novel Bleak House, and so I had the various texts was separate chapters of the novel, and I went to the trouble of looking up when it was that Charles Dickens was writing it. He started in May 1852 and went on right through to chapter 65 or 66 in the following year. And so I made a little list and imported that, and then it's possible for the system to remember what the dates are. Another possibility is to have an option in a window, so one can select a particular text, and here on the left you see Romeo and Juliet has been selected, and at the top we've got 1594, and I've pressed 3 of those circled options to make sure that it knows that this Romeo and Juliet play is to be associated with a particular date. So that's another way. Instead of having a list of a pre-prepared text list, it's also the way I devised that you would be able to just do it on the fly as long as you knew the date, and you'd have to press those various combinations to do it. And once you've done that, then you save the list that you've created as a sort of set of favorite texts, and then you can get it back every time, and of course it will then know what the dates are. Another part of the ideal would be we would have plots which would illustrate important aspects of our research. The whole point of a timeline plot would be to show things going up and down, rather like the example we just saw with toilet paper being in demand and going up and down. Timeline plots illustrating things that you're interested in your research. And also they need to be able to be shared so that you can get other people to work with you and see the plots and choose the bits that they think are important for shared research. The context I'm talking about today is research I do with Professor Reiner Grundmann of Nottingham University, and he's a sociologist who's interested in corpus methods, but is essentially a professor of sociology. And we've been working for probably nearly 10 years now on climate change and climate change research. And we live in different places, and I have a Windows computer, he has a Macintosh, and he's definitely not going to be buying a Windows computer anytime soon. He's going to keep on with his Mac, and I'm not going to be using a Mac anytime soon because I keep myself so busy with making wordsmith using a Windows computer. I haven't got time to learn to use a Mac. So we have to kind of try to find a way of sharing data. And of course, now with the virus, we have to share data over Zoom or Microsoft Teams or something. And that makes things a bit trickier too. So you will see that these timeline plots can get quite complex. But before I go into the timeline plot, I'm going to talk briefly about the dispersion plots, which here's a dispersion plot from Bleak House, which was written, as I said before, in 1852-3. The keywords here, so this is a keywords dispersion. Each of these little marks shows where each of these particular keywords occurs in the text. So the word him, just below the yellow bar, comes pretty well everywhere throughout the text. It's not a great surprise with that particular word. The second line you can see is Ada. She's one of the characters in the story, and she comes in bursts, but she comes more or less through the text. Dear comes quite well spread throughout the text. Tulkinghorn is a character. Oh, bucket is another character, by the way. So bucket comes in little bursts, and so does the yellow line that I got interested in. Smallweed is one of the characters in the story. I'm interested in the idea that there are bursts which we might need to be able to process, and might need to be able to identify the difference between words that are bursty or come in bursts versus words that are kind of global and come all the way through the text. I'm interested in this incidentally. I heard last night on the radio that the people who are working with this coronavirus research are now getting to a stage where there's a danger of further incidences of the disease coming back in countries where they've begun to be able to release some of the lockdown that they've had. And they're afraid, of course, everybody's afraid of the thing coming back, and not particularly afraid of it coming back generally, but the most likely thing they're thinking is it will come back in bursts or little occurrences that and I think they're giving it a K number apparently in the statistics. I was interested in trying to identify ways of homing in on these bursts and seeing if they can be organized so that you can separate out the bursty sort of elements from the non-bursty ones. And here's an example where the data has been sorted on its burstiness. So the burstiest of all are some of these are particular literary characters. Most of them, not all, but most of the keywords in this particular reference are people, and they come in very bursty. It's not surprising. Charles Dickens has a whole array of characters, and of course they don't all come all the time. They come in little mentions in occasional chapters, and then he comes back, and he's always got some clever way of referring to them so that you know that he keeps his hands in his pockets, or he makes a funny noise, or he keeps scratching his head, or she does whatever she does, and you begin to remember the host of characters because of these personal characteristics. This notion of bursts and burstiness was first to my knowledge anyway, written by 𝗟𝗲 Katz in 1996. And I've been interested in the idea since about 2000 or something, when I first got to hear of it, but never had a way of actually dealing with it. And now I've found a way of attempting to kind of sort out the bursts. I decided that the best way of working would be to think of it like this. There are large gaps between bursts. The whole idea of a burst is that there've got to be gaps between them. And then when you get a burst, there are going to be necessarily small gaps in the following sequence, and there will have to be a certain minimum number of members of a burst. In other words, you can't just have one hit with a great big gap on either side. It's got to be several together. And so those seem to me to be the criteria. This is all part of my struggle, my difficulty in working things through. And it's still work in progress, of course. It's quite possible that the system might need some further tweaking. Back to timelines and timeline plots. I'm working with my colleague and friend Rainer on a database of climate change, which is based, we've got a study involving UK newspapers with US newspapers, French newspapers, and German. And the data I'm going to be talking about now is going to focus on the UK newspapers, which I'm working with at the moment. There are 168 monthly texts. That starts in January 2005 and goes through to December 2018. Monthly text means all the texts from our database that were from a given month, in this particular case from UK newspapers, were selected with certain criteria. They're supposed to be texts about climate change, or where the focus on and the original database that we searched was climate change. Unfortunately, when you search on climate change, you don't always get climate change. You get texts which really are about climate change, but you get some other texts where there's a very incidental mention in a little joke at the end about climate change, or it's really a biography of somebody which is that tells you all about their life, and it turns out that for a couple of years they were involved in something to do with climate change. And so it's the text really about that person and not really at all about climate change, or only in very, very incidental way. So one of the issues we've had to work with is dealing with this quite large corpus of text, needing a lot of cleanup. So we've reduced, in this case, the UK data has been reduced to about 10%. So we've got now 3.4 million tokens when the original data was about 31 million. We've had to do a lot of cleanup and content filtering, and that's taken quite a lot of effort. So 168 texts on issues which are somehow centered on climate change from certain specified newspapers. These go into a database, and here we've got some of the terms which come up at the top of a database. Now these, in this particular piece of research, we're dealing with keywords. These are words which have been found to be key, or sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Key, in other words, outstanding words, unusual words in particular months. Let me just make that a bit clearer. The word shale is key in some months, but isn't key in all the 14 years of our text, the 168 months. It couldn't be, because the reference corpus here was a word list of the whole lot. So we're looking for things that are going up and down in particular months and proving to be quite exceptional. So there are some months when shale is particularly significant. There are some months when you may remember that Paris was an influential place for climate change research in 2015. There was an agreement, there was an accord. Donald Trump comes up. Donald Trump comes up. Why does Donald Trump come up? Well, partly because he was elected during the period we're talking about, and partly because he's had quite a lot to say about climate change, and his views have been commented on widely. So that's why Trump comes up. He's primarily the President of the United States, not primarily a climate change person, but climate change is one of the policies which he has opinions about. Coal, fossil, methane, pounds is probably, it is UK data, so this will be something to do with money, and solar, and a whole lot of terms. There are actually more than 5,000 terms going down vertically, and I've just shown you here the top few. So these are the keywords of each month. The reference corpus is the word list of all the 168 months, and it focuses on what is unusual in each particular month of data. Here is a timeline that's been made using this data. We get an overall picture. The first line gives a picture overall of the number of hits and the amount of data that, the amount of text data. The purple line shows you something about the amount of wording that there is, and it goes up. There's more data towards the end of the time, and the green line is to do with the actual hits of how many occurrences of shale or Paris or Trump or coal. If you look at Trump, you will see that the mentions of Trump, that word Trump, is particularly prominent in 2017, which is not a great surprise. Most of this is pretty obvious. Paris it's pretty obvious that Paris was going to be important, and one of the issues we've got is sorting out what is obvious, and you don't need a computer program to show you, and perhaps you'd ideally like your computer program to not show you the stuff that you think is obvious, to sort out the obvious from the non-obvious. The problem I've got, and this the reason why the talk is called a struggle, is because I've got 5,000 lines going down and I've got 14 years going horizontally. And how can I get my colleague Reiner to see this data and make sense of it and share it with me when he doesn't have the same computer as I do and can't run Wordsmith, and Wordsmith won't run on a Macintosh unless you use parallels and have a copy of Windows running, which some people do. That can be done, but I don't think Reiner does it. So how do I share data with Reiner? How to make sense of this data, how to filter essentially the data and try to find out you know, how to deal with the excess of data. I've got too many terms, I've got too many years, or in this case months. If I look at it in terms of months, I get 168 vertical compartments. How can I share the plots? How can I reorder the various terms in a useful way? How can I home in a sort of Sherlock Holmesian way? How can we together home in and try to make better sense of this data? So this is my struggle. There's an example. That's what it looks like if you see the month view. It's really complex. But again, we've still got the same few terms at the top of the list being prioritized, and we probably don't want to see all of these terms because we want to focus on all sorts of other issues. One solution that needs to be developed still, sometimes some of this is not finished, is filtering solutions. So we should be able to put in terms that we say, okay, don't show me if it's that term, have a stop list. Don't show me Trump, I'm not interested, because I already, anybody that's been reading the newspapers or seeing the media for the last several years has heard a lot about Trump and climate change, and that's not going to help me very much in my particular research endeavor. Another idea is to have a threshold for low frequency terms. So if some of the terms occur too infrequently, I might need to be able to filter them out. And another one might be to have a required number of peaks. So that's the first set of ideas, could be something to do with finding ways of filtering. Another set of solutions is to think about how we can sort the data. So we've got a vast amount of data. One facility that's been in Wordsmith for many years is this so-called set column, where you can type in a simple character or a number or even a word or phrase into a column of data and then sort on that. So the set column is like an empty column where you can put a note and then you can sort on that. So you can say this is category 1, this is the other one is category 2, category 3, or this is a verb, this is a noun, this is an adjective, and then sort easily on the set column. And that's in existence in this data already. Or sort by what I'm calling here a period score. So we sort on a particular month. Here we've got a period score selected where we're going to sort on the 12th month in 2009. And we're sorting to see what data, which data comes out top in 2009, December 2009, which of these 5,000 entries come out top on a period score. Another one would be what I'm calling peakiness. I'll come into that in a moment. Perhaps an easier idea to grab hold of is first peak and last peak and number of peaks. So we have to then be quite clear, what do we mean by a peak in a timeline like this? What is it? What constitutes a peak? What is meant by a peak? And we'll perhaps get to the term peakiness, where we've decided what a peak is. It's nothing to do with this movie. A peak, I propose a peak is something like it uses a proportion of hits to word count for each period. We call that a PHW, hits to word count. And a peak is where a period of time has a PHW, hits to word count proportion, greater than 1 standard deviation above the mean PHW over all periods. It's quite technical. So it's where something is higher and it's 1 standard deviation higher than the average for the whole range. You could think of a PHW maybe as few. So here we see some data with lots of peaks. We have to sum the PHWs in the periods, and then we can find out which is peak and which is a trough. Another aspect of this work is then exporting what I find. Once I've found ways of sorting it, export it into a format that Reiner can use or other people can use. And so really what we're interested in is some sort of standard way of exporting stuff which is not custom made. One difficulty I've had is that there are so-called EMF files. That's a Windows enhanced meta file, and a Macintosh unfortunately can't read such things. It's curious because it's something that Microsoft invented called an enhanced meta file, and what it allows you to do is export data in a sort of vector format so that you can pull it bigger and smaller, and it doesn't go out of focus and get all pixelated. If you make a so-called EMF, you can then put it into a Microsoft Office document, and actually on a Macintosh there it will open up okay and it works fine. But if the Macintosh basic system doesn't like EMF files, so that was one of the problems I had with Reiner. He couldn't look at the plots that I was making at first. So I had to find another way of putting pictures into a zip file for sharing, and those are just bitmap pictures. A third solution, which I've not gone into, but which could be relevant, is using other resources that are there, which will enable you to export this plot type data, which is not in the form of a text. You can export it to something which can be looked at in a browser. So vis-a-vis, Gapminder, D3 are visualization methods for exporting data and have it produce graphs for you, which anybody could see who was using a browser, on a phone or on whichever type of system. I haven't done that myself, and I think that might be quite an interesting way of working. Coming to an end now, reaching some conclusions. There are other means of tackling diachronic data. There are people who've been working on diachronic data throughout the world, diachronic corpora and so on. This is just my own personal means of tackling diachronic data, the kind of struggle I've been engaged in for the last few weeks in particular, and several years on timelines too. So I'm exploring methods to use with one's own corpora. So this is not really concerned with a corpus which is built into some database for general access, but the whole emphasis of Wordsmith has always been you use it with your own data, your texts you get from your students, or texts you find for yourself, or standard data like the British National Corpus, or other data which you can download, but then you do the analysis yourself on your laptop or desktop computer. And that's the kind of work I like to do and like trying to work with. So I'm exploring methods for that sort of corpus use. It's quite different from what Mark Davies does when he puts a corpus online and offers all sorts of incredibly powerful, and lots of other people with similar resources can look at all sorts of incredible data using resources that have been designed to use the power of huge databases on big computers. I'm not offering solutions here, I'm just really offering ideas, and I'm really basically recording a record of my own struggle. I think I'll probably stop at that point. There are various references here